Yesterday was Yogananda Ji's birthday. That's why we're having this special day today, the life and teachings of Yogananda. And Yogananda Ji said that his vibration, his essence, was really three aspects. One of divine love, the second, divine joy, and lastly, wisdom. And I was thinking that's a beautiful way to introduce Phil, because he is a man of love, joy, and wisdom. And the way that he explored and discovered the spirit of Yogananda to write this book was truly deeply inspiring. And the fashion in which he has shared it so openly, so freely, so joyfully with everyone. And the wisdom that he shares through diving into the whys, and diving into the oldest culture in the world, the Indian culture, and bringing it to the West in a way that's palatable, that's easy for us to assimilate and understand. So it's a great joy, Phil, to have you join us. Let's warmly welcome him.
You're very kind.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. I will do my best in the time we have to live up to that introduction. It's always a joy to participate in anything connected with Ananda. I took a tour group to India, as I am wont to do, and actually we visited the Delhi Center, and I gave a little talk there. Probably do the same next year in the south, in Chennai, where there's a lovely center. Yesterday was Yogananda's birthday, so it's a special treat to be here. I actually did a Facebook Live yesterday on the Ananda Facebook page, so it's a lovely weekend, and I commend you all for being here when you could be watching football games. But that's why God invented video recording. What I thought I'd do is, first, let me explain why I wrote The Life of Yogananda. Because I'm asked that all the time. So many millions of people have read the autobiography of a yogi, so why bother? And the answer is, I read the autobiography in 1970, and I still have that copy. It's a $5 hardcover. And I know I would not have had $5 in 1970, so I probably borrowed it and never returned it. And so this is my karmic. And absolving my theft. But I never became a disciple of Yogananda's or a formal student. I had my own path all these years, but Yogananda was one of the great teachers from whom I consistently learned. And when I wrote American Veda, and I had to cover the whole history of all these teachings from India coming to the West, and all the teachers who were instrumental in that, Yogananda really stood out because of his incredible contribution, and also because of the time period he was here and a lot of other reasons. And in the context of doing that, I reread the autobiography, I learned more about his life, and it became obvious to me that he left out a great deal, as did other people writing about Yogananda's life. And of course, the important thing with a world teacher like Yogananda is the teaching. So you don't need a biography of Yogananda to dig into what he taught and what he wanted to convey to especially people in the West. There's a vast library of his own writings and spoken word. There's all the teachers who he trained and the teachers they trained and the teachers here and elsewhere representing his lineage. But I wanted to fill in the gaps of his human story and look into all that he left out of his own autobiography and what was undiscovered by other people writing about him. And so it was quite a research task, and I'm very pleased when I hear from disciples of Yogananda and ardent devotees who already know a lot when they tell me they've learned even more because of my research. And it's that human story, how Mukunda Lal Ghosh, born in yesterday, January 5th, 1893 in India, became Paramahansa Yogananda and the author of this renowned autobiography and a world teacher whose teachings are still having a huge impact on the world. 67 years almost after he passed away. Did I get the math right? The human story fascinated me, and realizing there are huge gaps in the autobiography. I don't know how recently you read it, but if you go back and read the autobiography, you'll see sentences like, and 4 years passed in Boston. So now you have a whole chapter on those years, where I filled in the gaps. What actually happened? How did he get started? What was it like? But I was so interested in the human story, and it didn't dawn on me until I was finished with the book, how much I learned, not just about a fascinating narrative, because his life was really, really interesting. And I'm a storyteller, so I was absorbed in the narrative. But how much I learned from his life that is of help to me, and therefore to all of you and everybody on a spiritual path living in the world. And it's that I want to emphasize in the few minutes we have together, because you can read about his teachings, you can come here and learn about his teachings, practices, methodologies, and that's the main thing. You can read my biography, you can reread the autobiography, you can read about his life and learn a lot that's interesting. But if you read carefully and you look at his human story with discernment, and read a little bit between the lines, you'll also come away with lessons to be learned. Because I did, and I've been on my spiritual path for 50 years, because I'm old now. But, so I want to emphasize a few things so that when you read my book, when you go back and contemplate the events of Yogananda's life, you'll have these things in mind. I'm just going to emphasize a couple. One, every teacher that came here from India who had an impact had a job to do. And Yogananda is the quintessential example of this. Because when he came in 1920, at age 27, it was a very different time period than when Swami Vivekananda came 30 years earlier, and very different from the 60s and 70s when the bulk of the gurus who had an impact came. And he was, if not the only, certainly the most prominent teacher from India working at that time, and the first who actually stayed here and made the US his home and lived here for 3 decades or more. He and the others had to adapt the teachings, that these traditional teachings that have survived the onset of time and change in cultures and change in eras, that have survived for millennia because they're true and because they're effective. But the method of delivery and the language you use and what you emphasize will be different at different periods of time. Cultures change, customs change, mores change, values change, and in different parts of the world. So the way these teachings are represented in India, regardless of what the lineage is, and there's many, many lineages, is different from how they will be taught here. And all the successful gurus had to make those adaptations, and it's a very delicate thing to balance being true to a tradition, so you don't distort and you don't dilute and you don't corrupt the effectiveness of the teachings and the accuracy of the wisdom. At the same time, adapting the language and the method of delivery and the things you emphasize and the things you don't emphasize at different times for different people. And he is a perfect exemplar of that. I don't have to go into all the details of what he did, but some of it was looked upon askance by traditionalists who said, well, you don't do things that way. You don't transmit these teachings in writing by direct mail, which in the 20s was as innovative as an app would be today. You know, sending mail order, like in Sears Roebuck catalog. That was a departure from custom, but an important one, because think of how many more people could reach. Having Sunday morning services, they don't have that in India. Well, they do it Yogananda places, and maybe now the Ramakrishna mission will have Sunday morning, because it's become customary. But you know, if you go to a Hindu temple, it's very different from what you might have here on a Sunday morning or at any of the other centers of Yogananda's teaching. These are adaptations. The language changed. I was able to see by looking at the ads for his talks and looking at the topics he used, and how he's got to realize what Americans will like. So you start to see topics like using super consciousness to, you know, succeed in your business, and how to attract a soulmate, and better health, and all those, you know, self-help things, and practical results of these methods that would appeal to Americans more than, you know, achieve liberation of consciousness, become one with God. You know, that was always obviously his, you know, those were his priorities. But you get people in the door by promising practical results, and you see him learning that. And you see that with other gurus who came later. But of course, you would do that differently in 1968 than you would do in 1928, and those. So the point is, that's a lesson to be learned. Not in the same way, because you know, you may not be a teacher like Yogananda was, but you are adapting these ancient teachings and methods, practices into your life. And your life is different from somebody else's life. And you too have to make choices about when you do as you're instructed, or as the ideal might be traditionally, and when and how you adapt them into your own life. Yes?
Yes.
And I know what it's like to be, part of a spiritual organization, part of a spiritual group, and there's all these possibilities, but you have to always be true to yourself and what the teachings mean to you and how you integrate them into your life, because your life is different from somebody else's life. And seeing how Yogananda did that as a teacher and as a human being living his life in a new culture, right off the boat in Boston in 1920, you'll see an adaptation. In my book, in the photo section, or go online, you'll see his passport picture. He's wearing a beard. In the picture of him in the Boston Globe arriving on the ship, there's no beard. He learned on the boat, you don't want to stand out with that much. But he kept his long hair, and that because Sri Yukteswar would not have liked him cutting his hair. There's a picture. He would pull it back and put it under his hat so he didn't stand out in the streets that much. And as a dark-skinned man in the 20s, in places like Boston, he was going to stand out no matter what. And not in a good sense. This was a very racist country then, and he had to deal with that. And that was not easy. But he wore Western clothing when he was out, and he would tuck his hair back under his collar. So even on that relatively insignificant level, you can see the need to adapt, and yet remain true to his tradition, because when he taught, when he was being Yogananda, he wore traditional monk's clothing, and his hair was loose. And there was an incident where a picture of him was sent to India, and he had his hair pulled back, and Sri Yukteswar thought he had cut it. And this was not good. So he sent a new picture. So he said, I didn't cut it. So, and if you look at the teachings and how he adapted it, you could see that he never compromised on the tradition and the lineage that he was part of. But you adapt. And so that's similar to what we all have to do with these teachings. The other thing I want to emphasize, we don't have that much time, but I want to bring out what to me was perhaps the most surprising thing about researching the human story of Yogananda. His life was not easy. He had serious challenges. He had a mission that was very, well, first of all, that moment in time, it was a unique mission, but it was an important one, and he took it very seriously. And to accomplish what he did and what he set out to do, and there were serious obstacles. And the degree to which he was disappointed, betrayed, the degree of opposition he ran into, the degree to which he was the subject of gossip and rumor and front page, fake news, and racism, and organizational stuff. He called organizations hornet's nest. He didn't want anything to do with it. He realized he had to, and he was, in a sense, an entrepreneur, a CEO with a spiritual mission instead of a business one, but he had to pay the bills. He was in America for 5 years and in LA for only a few months when they found the center up on Mount Washington, that is, the mother center. It was a rundown place, they needed funds. He had an ambitious program. He traveled incessantly for 10 or 15 years. And, you know, you had to pay for the trains, you had to pay for the hotels, all that stuff. He had to deal with money and bills and shortfalls. He was worried about money a good deal of his life, you know, right till the end. And bear in mind, he arrives in 1920, it's the Roaring 20s. But he's doing something new. He's not selling real estate, you know. He's not, you know, selling widgets or whatever. He's teaching these teachings that are foreign to most people. There were many people couldn't wait to hear about Indian philosophy and learn to meditate and all that, but there were very few. You know, other teachers had set some foundation for that. And he was an odd-looking man and not trained as a, you know, an MBA or whatever. He needed to gather support and earn the trust of people who knew what they were doing and could help him. But I don't know if you've noticed this, but around spiritual organizations, there's a lot of sincere, well-meaning people who have no competence in worldly affairs, but they end up with responsibility. And he had those people to deal with, people who were not necessarily best intentioned. And he had to deal with a lot of stuff. And to his credit, you see in his letters and everything, he was very open and honest about that. And there were times when he wanted to give it all up because he was a monk and he just wanted to go back to India and walk along the Ganges and find a nice cave in the Himalayas and be with God. But he didn't, because he had a certain dharmic responsibility, a duty. He knew his Dharma, which is another lesson we can all learn, to really discern our personal Dharma, our spa Dharma, as it said, and be true to it. And he certainly was that. And he endured a lot. He worked very, very hard. But he never compromised on the main thing in life, the spiritual dimension of life, and always put that first, always taught people to put that first. But at the same time, he had to balance the spiritual life with the demands of the world. And those demands, you know, mind you, he was here less than 10 years, making a lot of progress once he moved to LA with a nationwide organization that was growing, and the market crashed. And he had, the next 10 years with a Great Depression, and things were horrible, even for hugely successful, knowledgeable business people. It was a difficult time. There were bankruptcies, there were failures. He had to live through that and deal with it, and feed people, and run an organization, grow an organization. World War II came, and through all this stuff, in the post-war years, he persevered through a lot of challenging times. Lawsuits, two major ones that I had to write about and research the details of, which, because they're very rarely spoken about. These are, things he had to deal with, and it was not easy for him. And that lesson of being true to your spiritual life and enduring the challenges, dealing creatively with the challenges, with grace, with dignity, with integrity, those are things we all need to learn. And that is, I find myself, I've been on a spiritual path for 50 years. I thought, I've learned these lessons. But then seeing a being like Yogananda have to deal with it, it changes your perspective a little bit. It's like, it's very easy when you get on a spiritual path because your life starts to change and you transform. I'm sure many of you will relate to this. And things get better, and things get easier, and you have more inner peace, and you have more love in your heart. And you get the impression that life now will be easy. And it'll just be this smooth smooth rise to enlightenment. And all the circumstances of life now, I'm finished with all of that travail and challenge. And then something happens. Someone dies, someone leaves you, somebody, you have a business failure. Stuff happens because we all have our karma, and we all interact with, our other people's karma, and the world's karma, and the country's karma, and everything else, and so did Yogananda. So if he had to deal with stuff, I don't feel so bad. I will not allow myself to say, oh, I'm a spiritual person, I shouldn't have to deal with it. But he didn't just run away from it. He had to deal with it because it was his Dharma. And that was, he could easily have said, you know what, I don't need this. I'm going back to India. And he was tempted, and he was honest about that temptation. Especially when he was in India for that 1 year in the 30s. You see it in his letters, oh, I was with these sadhus and sannyasis, I just want to be with them. But he didn't, he knew what he had to do. And he worked hard. And that's a balance and a perspective, that we all have to remind ourselves of from time to time. And I find inspiration and insight in Yogananda's human story for that reason, among other things. One more thing, because of the times we live in. I know for people who are serious about their spiritual lives, there's times when they want to say, you know what, I'm tuning out. The world is too crazy. I don't want to deal with this stuff. I'm above that. I'm above the noise and clamor of what's on the news and all this stuff. I want to just be pure. There's something to be said for that. But at the same time, we're citizens, and we're here, and the world events affect us, and our behavior affects the world events. And one of the things I found very inspirational about Yogananda's life was he was a renunciant. He knew all this was Maya and all that, but he didn't use that as an excuse to not care or to be indifferent. He spoke out. He spoke out against racism. He spoke out against greed. He spoke out against the mistreatment of certain groups of people. He was a huge supporter of the Indian independence movement and Gandhi. And mind you, and he would speak out about that through the 20s and 30s, right up to independence. And it was risky because he was a British subject. India was not independent. He could not be a citizen of the US. That came much later when he finally couldn't after the war and after Indian independence. He could have, the Brits were spying on him. That's one of the things I learned in my research. They were looking into these possible subversive Indians who were in America, especially prominent ones like him. They were opening his mail, but he spoke out. And he spoke out about war and world events and Italy and Germany and all the rise of fascism. And I took that as a lesson myself, that you can be internally detached, but as a human being living in the world, you're part of it. He had a platform, he used it, he cared. And something to think of. Well, I was going to leave time for Q&A, but we don't have any. It's 12:30. What should we do? Stop? Open it up?
Let me take one question.
The most important question. Who has the best question? No one wants to risk it. Yes.
What was his favorite job? Did he do any work?
What was?
Besides the spiritual sharing, did he like gardening more?
Oh,
What?
Yeah, oh, good. Okay. That's one of the joys of looking into the human side of a world-class teacher like Yogananda, because you realize they're all different, and he had his likes and dislikes. And I emphasized all the challenges and everything, but he really had a good time. He really enjoyed life. He loved to travel. He loved sightseeing. He fell in love with America on, just traveling around, seeing the West and the landscape of America. He wrote these great poems and essays about his travels. He loved sightseeing. He loved collecting artifacts from different cultures. He loved music, not just, and wrote a lot of stuff. He would go to movies. He would take people to go see Westerns and, that sort of thing. He liked listening to radio serials, I was told. In those days it was pre-television, obviously. And gardening and cooking. He was a great cook. And he loved making delicacies. He loved, hosting banquets and participating in the cooking of food, and he loved eating it too. May have contributed to the illnesses he dealt with later in life. And he loved, he laughed a lot. The stories of the disciples who were close to him are very moving and heartwarming. And of course they emphasized the lovability and all that. But they also emphasized, that he was quite the disciplinarian. There was a lot of tough love, just as he experienced with Sri Testament. But he had, he had his favorite pleasures and enjoyments. He loved, packing people up into the, a car and going on picnics. And camping out and sightseeing around Southern California. So renunciates can enjoy the pleasures of life too, and he did.
Many there are.
The rasa, as they say in Sanskrit, the pleasures, enjoyments. Yeah. Okay, one more.
Watched a Netflix film on Yogananda, and it seemed that he focused a lot on a mother. Why was that?
He focused on mother.
Focused
The
on
Divine Mother?
Divine Mother, yeah.
Why? If you look at his work, you'll see sometimes he refers to the divine as Father, sometimes as Mother, and the mother part was, I think, very important in his work in the West, because we have the Judeo-Christian tradition as Big Daddy in God. And he balanced that. You'd see it at different times. It would be Father God, sometimes Mother. And if you want to be psychological about it, he lost his own mother, whom he loved, when he was 11 years old. It was a big deal in his life. I mean, and one of the things about Yogananda's life, the human story, is we're able to find out a lot. A lot of gurus, once they renounce, you don't know a whole lot about their lives. But he wrote about it, spoke about it, and so he was very honest about the loss of his mother and what a huge impact that has. So you could say, because he did at a certain point, that his love for the divine, his love for his own mother, once her human form was not there, was transferred to his devotion to the Divine Mother. And maybe you could make a case for it. That's one of the reasons it became such an important thing for him to emphasize as a teacher. But you don't have to go there, because gurus who don't lose their mothers also have devotion to the feminine aspect of the divine as well as the masculine. So. Thank you.